Hello everybody, it's Miss Fincham, and today we're continuing Unit 2 by covering topic 1.1, the living world ecosystems, which is the introduction to all the diversity in our world. Thanks to Jordan Smeets for the slides and note outlines that we use in this class. Our objective for the day is to be able to explain how resource availability influences species interaction. We will talk about predator and prey relationships, and we will talk about symbiosis, which is when two organisms from different species live in very close association with each other. We will also talk about competition and resource partitioning or resource sharing. Our science skill that we are looking at today is to describe environmental concepts and processes. Before we go any further, there is some chemistry you need to work on memorizing. Please put these over in the left-hand side of your notes underneath the elements that you need to know, the ions you need to know, and the compounds that you need to know. Be familiar with both the name and the chemical symbol for each of them. So for nitrogen, you need to know that it's both the capital N or N2, and oxygen O or O2. Otherwise, if it's just the single formula, then that is just the only way that you need to know that element, ion, or compound. These are things that you will be quizzed on, and they are also things that if you misidentify them in an FRQ, you will lose your point. Before we get into the ways that organisms interact with each other, we do need to cover the basics of ecosystems. First, let's talk about the organization of populations in ecosystems. The smallest group in an ecosystem is an individual or just one single organism. Remember that an organism is a living thing. In our diagram here, we have one individual elk. When we use the term population, we're referring to a group of organisms that are all the same species. In our diagram, we have an elk herd. It's very important that we distinguish that they are all members of the same species. Then we have a community. A community is all of the living organisms or biotic elements in a given area, which includes the trees, the grass. Here we have a beaver by the tree, and we even have a rabbit, as well as a bobcat and an owl. It even includes the bacteria and fungi that live in the soil. It is all of the living or biotic organisms in an area. Then we have the ecosystem. The ecosystem is where we add in the non-living components as well, which we call the abiotic components. These are things like rocks, soil, and water. They interact with the living things in the ecosystem, and those two together, living and non-living, biotic and abiotic, are all the components when we're talking about an ecosystem. Finally, a biome is a large area that has a similar climate, and that is going to ultimately determine the plants and animals that can live there. For example, the tropical rainforest is an area that is very warm and has really high rainfall. That is why we see such a wide variety of plant and animal species in the tropical rainforest. Species and organism interactions occur in multiple ways. This chart is a helpful reminder for the outcome of the different types of interactions we will talk about. First, we have competition. Competition is a lose-lose situation due to organisms fighting over a shared resource like food or shelter. This is going to limit their population size because there are not enough resources to go around. This creates a loss for both species involved. Next, we have predation. Predation is when one organism uses another as its food source or as its energy source. This is going to be positive for the first species, but it's going to be a negative for the second species because that species will either die or be severely harmed by that use of energy. Then we have mutualism. Mutualism is a relationship that is beneficial for both species, so it's a win-win. A great example that we've already talked about is that of the coral reef, where we have little tiny animals called coral, and they interact with photosynthetic algae to form a reef ecosystem. Finally, we have commensalism. Commensalism is kind of like me referring to one of the species being a free rider. In a commensalistic relationship, we have one species that's benefiting and one species that's not affected at all. A great example is birds making their nest in trees. The birds do not damage or hurt the tree, but they also do not benefit the tree at all. Predation is when one organism eats another organism. This means technically herbivores, animals that eat plants, are practicing predation. We may not think of a giraffe eating a tree or eating the leaves of a tree as a form of predation. We may not think of a giraffe as a predator in a strict sense of what that term predation means. However, the giraffe uses the tree for energy, and so herbivory, or the act of an animal eating a plant, is still considered predation. Then we have the true predators. These are the carnivores. Animals such as the leopard or the lion are going to eat the giraffe, and this is what we think of when we think of predators. And we call these true predators to distinguish them from the herbivores. Then we have parasites. A parasite is still going to use another organism for energy, but it's usually much smaller than what we call the host organism, which is the organism that it often lives inside of or attaches to the outside of. Oftentimes, the parasite will be able to draw energy from the host without killing it. We have an example here of the sea lamprey, which is sort of an eel-like organism that will attach itself to a fish and draw the blood out of the fish. We also have organisms like mosquitoes and tapeworms, and again, they are just going to draw energy out of the organism, but they don't necessarily kill the organism. Then we have parasitoids. A parasitoid is a very specific type of parasite that's going to lay its eggs inside of the host organism. Then when the eggs hatch, the larvae or the young eat their way out of the host organism. This often kills the host. Here we have an example of a parasitic wasp that is going to inject its eggs into the caterpillar. When those eggs hatch, they are going to eat their way outside of the caterpillar and be a great source of energy to the wasp, but unfortunately the caterpillar is going to die as a result of this interaction. Next, we have symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. The root term in this phrase can tell us what it means. Sym means together, bio means living, and osis means condition or state of being. Symbiosis means a state of being where two species are living closely together. We should remember that symbiosis is not necessarily good or bad. It's just a long-term interaction between two organisms of different species. It is not two squirrels living together. Those are members of the same species. It is two organisms of different species living in close association with one another for a long period of time. It can be mutualistic, where both species benefit, but it can even be commensalistic, or one species benefits and the other is not impacted. Even parasites and their host are considered symbiotic relationships because they live in such close association for long periods of time. For now, we will focus on mutualism, which is a form of symbiosis that benefits both species. This means that both species are going to come away from this relationship better off than they would have been without it, and in many cases they depend on each other to an extent that they could not really survive apart. A great example is again our coral reef ecosystem. Coral are actually tiny animals that are going to create the reef structure that algae rely on for a home. They are going to provide carbon dioxide for the algae to do photosynthesis, and in return the algae provides sugars via photosynthesis that the coral uses as energy. We can see here that we have these tiny little organisms called coral, and the individual corals are actually called a polyp. They are going to live in the reef, but again, they are going to produce that carbon dioxide that the algae need in order to do photosynthesis. The reef that they create is a home for the algae, which is a great relationship for both, and they really depend on each other. Another mutualistic relationship, which is actually such a close relationship that we consider the two species one single composite organism, meaning that they live so closely together that they function like one organism, and that is lichen. Lichen refers to a broad class of organisms where fungi live in very close proximity with algae, and the algae providing the sugars or the energy the fungi need, and the fungi provide the nutrients that the algae need in order to photosynthesize and grow. We can see here again, it is these two organisms, a fungus and an algae, that live so closely together that they function basically as one single organism. You can also find this type of relationship with legumes, which have a rhizobia bacteria that grows in nodules on their roots, and it converts nitrogen from the air into ammonia that the plant uses to grow. Finally, we have competition. In competition, remember that it's going to be a lose-lose situation. Both species that are competing with each other are going to have fewer organisms survive, and their populations are going to be smaller as a result. However, something called resource partitioning or resource sharing can allow these different species to utilize the same resources in slightly different ways. That is going to reduce competition. I want to point out that the species do not get together and have a meeting about this. They do not strategize. It is just the idea that evolution favors traits that allow them to utilize the same resource but in a slightly different way. There are 3 different types of resource partitioning. The first is called temporal partitioning. This is where organisms or species that compete for a shared resource are going to use the resource at slightly different times to avoid direct competition. Here we have the wolf and the coyote. They are both going to hunt for small mammals, but they're going to do so at different times of the day. This way they avoid directly competing for the same hunting territory. Spatial partitioning is using different areas of a shared resource. Here we have an example of 2 different grasses where one can send its roots to an extremely deep portion of the soil, while the other can access shallower parts of the soil, and so they're not going to compete directly for water and nutrients in the soil because of the different levels that their roots are with one another. A different example of spatial partitioning is where all of these different species of warbler will occupy slightly different portions of the same tree to make their nest and to find their food. This is going to allow so many more birds to occupy the same tree than if they all directly competed for the exact space within that tree. And as you can see by the shaded parts on each part of the tree, that's where the different species of the warbler live. Finally, we have morphological partitioning. Morphological partitioning is when species that hunt for the same resource will evolve slightly different body features in order to utilize different portions of that resource. Here we have a ferret and an ermine. They have evolved slightly different jaw sizes and slightly different tooth patterns, which enables them to hunt for different sized prey. This makes it so they do not have to compete directly for the same exact resource. The big takeaway here from resource partitioning is that it reduces competition, and that enables species to thrive and grow to larger population sizes because they don't have to directly compete with each other for the same exact resource in the same place at the same time. Our practice FRQ for topic 1.1 today will cover the skill of describing an environmental concept and process. Look at this food web here and identify 2 organisms that would compete for a shared food resource. After you have identified them, describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the 2 organisms that you identify. When you have finished your notes, don't forget to take pictures or scan them using your Chromebook and upload them into Canvas. Make sure your pictures are readable when you submit them so that feedback about your FRQ can be given as needed.